Hey, AP Macro. Okay, moving into aggregate supply. Again, this is a little bit of a shorter lecture, so we'll buzz through this one as well. Okay, what is aggregate supply? Aggregate supply, just like aggregate demand, it's the amount of all the goods and services that firms, so businesses, will produce in an economy at different price levels, right? So it's the supply for everything by all firms, right? All of it together. Aggregate supply differentiates between short run and long run, and there's actually two curves here. So this is where we get away from a standard supply and demand. When we move into aggregate demand and aggregate supply has two curves, a short run curve and a long run curve. I'll explain each one. Short run aggregate supply, wages and resource prices will not increase as price levels increase, right? So as the price of goods changes, the wages and how much it costs to produce stuff stays the same in the short run. In the long run, though, wages and resource prices will increase as price levels increase. So if prices of things get more expensive, people's wages do change, right? So that happens in the long run. So let's talk short run first. In the short run, wages and prices will not increase as price level increases, okay? So they don't change. This functions pretty much like a standard supply curve does. So if a firm currently makes 100 units and they're sold for $1 each, their only cost is $80 to pay their workers. So that means their profit, $100 total, right? Because they're selling 100 units at $1 each. That's how much money they made, minus the $80 to pay their workers. They made $20 in profit. What happens in the short run is price levels, if the price levels double, so now the goods now cost twice as much. Now 100 units and you're selling them for $2 each, so we've doubled prices. Our total revenue is now $200 as opposed to $100. How much is our profit? Well, our profit now is $120, right? Because our wages didn't change. We just go 200 minus 80, and that gets us our $120. So what this does, when we make high profits, right, the firms have the incentive to increase production. Firms are going to chase profits. If profits are being made, they're going to try and supply more of whatever good they're making profit on, right? So in the short run, this tells us that we should supply more. And we would think it increase, so that's going to increase aggregate supply, right? We'll make more. Functions kind of similar to how a supply curve works. So our short run aggregate supply curve is pretty straightforward. It looks just like a regular supply curve, but now we label it aggregate supply, AS. Again, remember price level on the y-axis, GDP real on the x-axis, right? Aggregate supply is the production of all the firms in the economy, right? So it's just all the supply added together. So that one's pretty straightforward. In terms of how it moves, it works kind of like a regular supply curve. If profits are being made, it will increase. And if profits are being lost, it will decrease. The long run aggregate supply curve functions a little differently. So in the long run, wages and resource prices will increase as price levels increase. So here's our same example. The firm has a total revenue of $100 and they pay $80 for labor. Okay, their profit's $20. So that hasn't changed. What happens in the long run if we double the prices? So now we have a total revenue of $200, right? We doubled prices. We pay $80 in labor, right? In the long run, workers are going to demand higher wages to match the prices. Stuff now costs those workers, when they go buy stuff, it costs them twice as much as it did before. So they're going to demand higher wages. It's a pretty regular thing, right? As we see price levels go up, workers want to get paid more, right? And that's why like teachers get paid another couple percent every year to keep up with inflation. So eventually your labor costs are going to double, okay? So now your profit is $40, but the real profit is unchanged, right? Because prices double. So if the prices double, it looks like you doubled your profit, but really nothing changed, right? It stayed the same. Because wages slowly will creep their way back up to keep up with the price level. So in if real profits don't change, the firm has no incentive to actually increase output. Therefore, they're not going to produce any more in the long run, right? So it kind of messes with stuff a little bit. So the long run aggregate supply curve, the LRAS, or as all my other students have liked to call it, the LRAS, looks like this, okay? So in the long run, price levels increase, but GDP doesn't, right? So things get more expensive, price levels can increase, GDP won't change because we're not actually gonna produce any more. So our LRAS, our long run aggregate supply, is a straight vertical line, okay? It goes straight up. This line represents full employment, okay? So we assume that in the long run, the economy will be producing at full employment, right? So that's right where we want to be. That's where our economy is maxing their production. Our unemployment's right where it needs to be, right? So this is our full employment line, right? So we label it QY, right? So this is quantity at full employment. That's our long run line, okay? We're going to eventually put these curves together and I'll show you how they all move around, but just note, in the long run, it's just a straight vertical line. Prices can change, quantity won't change at all. Okay, so now we got those two pieces down. Let's talk about shifts of aggregate supply. This is short run shifts. Remember, the long run curve doesn't actually shift. So our acronym to get these is RAP, R-A-P. There's 3 of them. So shifts of aggregate supply, here's our short run aggregate supply curve, right? An increase or decrease in national production can shift the curve right or left. If we can now produce more in our country, we're going to shift to the right. And if we can produce less in the country, we're going to shift to the left, okay? So the first shifter is change in resource prices. So the price of domestic and imported resources. These are the things we build stuff out of, right? This is the steel to build a car, resources to build stuff. Increase in the price of Canadian lumber, right? So lumber gets more expensive that we get from Canada. That is going to decrease aggregate supply and shift it to the left. Decrease in the price of Chinese steel. Steel's now cheaper. We can access it at a better deal. That's going to lead to more profit for the firms and they will supply more. So aggregate supply will shift to the right. Any kind of a major supply shock. So if we have a negative supply shock, suddenly something happens and what was once the number that of something we could supply, it's dramatically dropped, right? That's going to decrease aggregate supply. And a positive supply shock. So suddenly there's more out there, we discover more oil or something like that. That's a positive supply shock that will increase aggregate supply. This right here is what we are experiencing in our economy, a negative supply shock right now. Because we have shut things down, the supply of the goods that we use to build stuff has dramatically changed, right? There's way less of it, therefore aggregate supply has shifted. This is a little different than we see in normal recessions. And I'm going to explain why this recession we're headed into is different than what we've seen in the past, but it's because of this huge negative supply shock we've seen. Inflationary expectations. If people expect higher prices in the future, right? So they expect that there's going to be a bunch of inflation. They just assume that it's coming, right? So this is kind of an odd one. If producers expect higher prices in the future, okay, the workers will demand higher wages and the cost will increase. So it's actually going to decrease aggregate supply. So when people expect inflation, aggregate supply will decrease. Our next piece, changes in actions of the government, okay? So this is the A, actions of the government. This is not government spending. Government spending affects aggregate demand. This is actions of the government. So, taxes on producers. If we lower corporate taxes, so we tax them less, they have more, so they can supply more. So that's going to increase aggregate supply. And if we subsidies for domestic producers, right? So we now are paying money to people for specific stuff to be produced. Lower subsidies for domestic farmers, for example, right? They're gonna supply less, therefore aggregate supply will shift to the left, it'll decrease. Government regulations plays a big role in actions of the government. So say the EPA tightens up requirements for farmers, right? So now there's more regulations on what they can use and how they can do stuff. That's going to decrease aggregate supply, right? So the tighter government regulations are, the less aggregate supply. The looser they are, the more aggregate supply. And then changes in productivity is the last piece here. So that's the P in RAP. Technology plays a huge role in this. So let's say there's a computer virus that destroys half of the computers in the world, right? That's going to make us produce less and decrease aggregate supply, right? Let's say there's some kind of major advantage in technology is released, right? So there's a teleportation machine that would increase aggregate supply, right? So it all kind of works out like that. So that's just the kind of the starting of long run and short run aggregate supply. We're going to get deeper into this in upcoming lectures, but now you have the building blocks that we can start to build this graph off of.